Chapter 3, Relations of Production. Section 1. If forces of production are not the things they are so often taken to be, then definitions of production relations, and hence Marx's economic structure of society, in terms of ownership of these forces, are clearly in some jeopardy. But there is far more to be said about the concepts of production relations and economic structure than this. We may begin with a common criticism of historical materialism to which I briefly alluded in Chapter 1. In the 1859 preface, as we know, Marx says that property relations, quote, are but a legal expression for, end quote, relations of production, and his writings frequently assimilate to the two terms. H.B. Acton, among others, has argued that this renders Marxism incoherent. It amounts, Acton says, to defining production relations, the alleged economic base of society, by legal forms which belong in the very superstructure of that base within historical materialist theory is supposed to determine. The theory is thus viciously circular. Acton goes on to argue more generally that, quote, the material or economic basis of society is not something that can be clearly conceived, still less observed, apart from the legal, moral, and political relationships of men, end quote. Acton. This charge is obviously a serious charge for any Marxism which wishes to retain a standard base superstructure model, and it has not gone unchallenged. Cohen in particular has replied at length. On the face of it, he has little trouble in disposing of Acton's argument. He simply develops a general rechtsfrei definition of ownership in terms of real powers over, as distinct from legal rights in, the objects owned, productive forces as he conceives them. Other Marxists, like Balibar, take a similar tack. Within such views, Marx's production relations are ownership relations in some distinctively non-juridical sense. Legally formalized property relations can then coherently be conceived as both distinct from and expressive of production relations thus defined, exactly as the 1859 preface seems to require. This resolves Acton's problem of the independent conceivability of economic structure and superstructure. Cohen further argues, not unreasonably, that the fact that economic variables may not be empirically observable independently of the non-economic variables they are held to determine does not of itself invalidate the claim of determination. Such situations, he maintains, are commonplace in any developed science. Cohen's solution is a nice and characteristically elegant piece of philosophical reasoning, but whether it satisfactorily resolves the substantial problem which lies at the heart of Acton's comments is another issue. Consider by way of example the following satirical observation of E.P. Thompson's on the supposed relative, quote, relative autonomy of law. Thompson's ear is directed at Althusser's so-called structural Marxism rather than Cohen's, but the point is pertinent nonetheless. Quote, I have, as it happens, been interested in this myself, in my historical practice, not of course in any grand way, for the whole of history, nor for the capitalist mode of production everywhere, but in a very petty conjuncture, in an island on the edge of the Atlantic, very well supplied with lawyers, at a moment in the 1700s. So my evidence is highly marginal, as well as being seriously contaminated by empirical content. But what I discovered there would make la structure dominante boggle. For I found that law did not keep politely to a level, but was at every bloody level. Law was imbricated within the mode of production and production relations themselves, as property rights, definitions of agrarian practice, and law was simultaneously present in the philosophy of Locke. Law intruded brusquely within alien categories, reappearing bewigged and gowned in the guise of ideology. Law danced a cotillion with religion, moralizing over the theater at Tyburn. Law was an arm of politics, and politics was one of law's arms. Law was an academic discipline, subjected to the rigors of its own autonomous logic. Law contributed to the definition of the self-identity, both of rulers and ruled. Above all, law afforded an arena for class struggle, within which alternative notions of law were fought out. End quote. E.P. Thompson. La structure dominante is Althusser's, quote, structural causality model, referred to above. Althusser, like Cohen and many other Marxists, supposes the separability of the economic from other levels of social structure. It is this separation Thompson rejects, going on to ridicule the very notion of levels, motoring around history at different speeds and on different schedules, as a, quote, academic fiction, end quote. I could have cited other Marxist historians like Christopher Hill on Koch's Institutes, or Rodney Hilton on jurisdiction in feudal Europe to similar effect. Cohen's rebuttal of Acton is, significantly, carried out entirely within theory, at the level of a general transhistorical concept of property. It is undoubtedly successful as a piece of philosophical argument. To develop a rechtsfrei definition of property raises no particular difficulties of a theoretical sort. But what the passage from Thompson scathingly brings out is that as soon as we try to apply such a definition and specify historically what real power over objects, property as Cohen conceives it, empirically consists in, then those things excluded from it, its general rechtsfrei definition, tend ineluctably to creep back in. For we rapidly discover that, quote, powers over objects, end quote, including here people's laboring capacities, only exists empirically in forms which include things which, according to the standard dogma, ought to belong in the supposed superstructure. In 18th century England, for instance, we may not be able to say in any empirically meaningful way what property or production relations were without talking about game laws, the so-called Bloody Code, parliamentary acts of enclosure, strict settlement and entail, magistrates' regulation of hours of work and rates of pay, combination acts, the theatrical rituals of the assizes, or laws prohibiting the shearing of sheep within 5 miles of the coast. Historical inquiry shows what Adam Smith called the, quote, orderly oppression of the law, end quote, to be an integral part of, internal to, constitutive of, the complex web of social relations we summate as property in this particular time and place, not a, quote, relatively autonomous instance, end quote, at all. In the real world, then, power over objects turns out to be neither the abstraction nor the simple relationship of Cohen's impeccably rechtsfrei definition. It exists only in a multiplicity of often rechtsvoll empirical forms, to whose analysis, if Thompson is correct, a categorical framework built on prior and exclusive definitions of supposed social levels is remarkably ill-suited. In certain cases, like England in the 18th century, law will emerge inextricably, quote, imbricated within, indeed constitutive of, any property relations we might want to consider relations of production, quote, part of the same nexus of relationship, end quote. So, too, might other supposedly superstructural instances, like moral codes, political institutions, or forms of social consciousness, all of which are fairly evidently entailed in Smith's, quote, orderly oppression. In which case, to seek to expunge these from the concept of property or production relations a priori, for the sake of theoretical coherence or elegance, would seem to be a gross artificiality which does considerable violence to the very facts Marx's concepts are meant to help us understand, a species of what Marx himself castigated as, quote, violent abstraction. Section 2. Cohen, however, tells us that he, quote, does not need to be advised that history is always richer in content, more varied, more many-sided, more lively and subtle, than any theory will represent it as being, end quote. Quoting Lenin. Balibar's concern is likewise with outlining only what he calls the, quote, pertinent differences, on whose basis the abstract concepts of mode of production can be theoretically developed. Either would therefore presumably dismiss the foregoing line of argument as besides the point. A reminder, perhaps, of the real complexity of history, but not something which should be allowed to affect the basic formulation of Marx's theoretical concepts as such. To forestall this objection, a short philosophical aside is in order, for I do not cite Thompson here simply to counterpose the real complexity of history against the errant simplicities of history. Worthwhile and necessary as that enterprise sometimes is. I want rather to make a theoretical point concerning the character of general concepts, like property and their relation to empirical particulars, of the sort invoked by Thompson. This follows on the argument I developed in section 2 of the last chapter, and relates to the difference between Marx's transhistorical and historical categories. Only if this difference is ignored, I shall argue, can Thompson's, or indeed Acton's argument, be dismissed as merely empiricist quibble, which is irrelevant to considerations of high theory, and the relation between abstract theory and concrete fact be construed in the way it is by Cohen or Balibar. The empiricism, in fact, is, if anything, theirs, and resides in the tacit assumption, an assumption shared by positivist philosophies of science generally, that fact and theory are wholly separate domains of discourse. In the Holy Family, there is a celebrated discussion of some of the more absurd practices of idealist philosophy. One of these absurd practices is the fallacy of reification, or misplaced concreteness, mistaking abstract concepts for real entities. Marx dubs this, quote, the mystery of speculative construction, end quote. By way of illustration, Marx satirizes philosophers, his specific target here being the young Hegelians, as taking the general concept fruit to refer to some real essence of fruitiness, which is distinct from the empirical forms in which fruit alone exists, apples, pears, and so on. Wittgenstein was later similarly to chide those who imagined that beauty was a real essence, inhering in and defining all beautiful objects. Nobody, we might think, would be so silly. But like fruit or beauty, property, too, at least as Marx conceives property, does not exist except in particular empirical forms. As with production, property has no existence as a generality. We might indeed be able to abstract from these particulars conceptually in order to construct a general notion of property. But such an abstraction, rechtsfrei or otherwise, does not refer to some real essence of property independent of its empirical forms, any more than the generic fruit refers to anything other than real apples and pears. In more technical terms, generic concepts refer to what defines classes of phenomenon. Not, or at any rate not directly, to any empirical particulars, real objects as such at all. And as Wittgenstein again argues, what makes phenomena members of the same class may be something as loose as, quote, family resemblances, rather than any unvarying list of empirical characteristics which they all necessarily have in common. Now such class concepts, precisely because they are generic categories, are not in themselves complete descriptions of any of the individual phenomenon which can be subsumed under them. Indeed, and crucially, they do not adequately comprehend the essential features of these phenomenon, if by that we mean those features which make such phenomenon what those phenomenon individually are, and are thus to those phenomenon's definition, and are thus essential to those phenomenon's definition. Class concepts only designate those aspects of a given set of phenomenon which makes them members of the relevant class, the resemblance by virtue of which they can be conceived as members of the same family. What defines phenomenon is their individual particularity. In other words, the phenomenon's real existence is precisely those features they do not share with other members of the class to which they belong and are therefore not contained in their class concept. We have not, for instance, adequately defined a lemon in any empirical sense when we say that a lemon is a fruit. Part of any adequate empirical description of lemon would include, for example, the lemon's color. But yellowness is not a characteristic of fruit as such or in general, and cannot be derived from the general concept of fruitiness. Yellowness is, however, essential to what makes a lemon, and is thus part of the lemon's concept. Similar arguments apply to property. Certainly we may choose to define the class property in general and abstractly in ways which exclude superstructural terms. There may even be a point in doing so, insofar as such a definition enables to classify certain legal and non-legal forms of relationship as kindred phenomena, which we certainly could not do if we included legal criteria in property's general concept. Thus far, we may go along with Cohen against Acton. To do so is also consistent with Marx, who undoubtedly did take pains to insist that relations, which were substantially property relations, could exist without being legally expressed as such, as in passages like this. Quote, with Wagner, there is, first, the law, and then commerce. In reality, it's the other way around. At first, there is commerce, and then a legal order develops out of commerce. In the analysis of the circulation of commodities and capital, I have demonstrated that in a developed trade, the exchangers tacitly recognize each other as equal persons and owners of the goods to be exchanged respectively by them. They do this while they offer the goods to one another and agree to trade with one another. This practical relation, arising through and in exchange itself, only later attains a legal form in contracts, etc. But this form produces neither its content, the exchange, nor the relation existing in it of persons to one another, but vice versa. End quote. Marx, 1880. If our generic concept of property includes legal terms, the quote, practical relation, Marx recognizes here as a property relation, could not be acknowledged as such, which would be plainly contrary to his intent. But we should not then confuse such a general definition of property with property's substantial reality, or take our generic concept adequately or immediately to designate real empirical objects. Nor in particular can we infer that what our concept excludes as a general characteristic of the class property can a fortiori be excluded from the concepts of the individual members of that class. Property's particular forms, the only forms in which property empirically exists. To do so would be exactly like denying that yellowness is an essential characteristic of lemons, because yellowness is not a feature of the generality fruit, an evident non sequitur. What my quote from Edward Thompson suggests, on empirical grounds, what my quote from Edward Thompson suggested on empirical grounds, was that precisely as we moved from the general concept of class property to the concepts of the class property's members, as soon as, in other words, we try to specify empirically those historical forms of property which are Marx's particular concern, we cannot any longer always exclude so-called superstructural terms. Like the yellowness of the lemon, they might be essential, and hence defining features of the property relations empirically at issue. At first sight, this appeared simply as an ill-bred empiricist counter to Cohen's or Balibar's attempts rigorously to demarcate economic and legal at the level of a general theory. But it is in fact testimony to a lapse in their own logic. Even had Thompson not been burying his head in the archives, we would have had no license to exclude law or anything else a priori from counting, should the evidence warrant it, as internal to a given property form. For recognition of the internality of superstructural relations to a given empirical form of property in no way conflicts with adherence to a Rex-Frey definition of the concept of property in general. No general concept of property can or ever could be exhaustive of the empirical characteristics which define property's particular forms. It is impossible in logic to infer the concepts of members of a class, their differentia specifica, from the concept of the class itself. But for exactly the same reason, Rexful specifications of these forms cannot be ruled out by virtue of the general Rex-Frey definition alone either. Cohen can only evade this conclusion by implicitly reifying his general concept of property, taking it as immediately specifying an empirical particular. Cohen treats Rex-Frey property as if Rex-Frey property were an entity in itself, a substance really distinct from the legal and other forms in which property empirically exists, rather than, like fruit, a mere class concept, specifying some characteristics or family resemblances real empirical forms of property have. A predicate, to use Marx's own vocabulary, is thus surreptitiously transformed into an independent subject. If we refuse the reification, however, and properly distinguish the general concept of property, however defined, from the concepts of property's particular forms, Acton's contention may still make eminent sense when applied to the concept's particular forms. Cohen's refutation of Acton rests on this tactic and wholly illicit conflation of these distinct levels of conceptualization, transhistorical and historical, to employ my earlier terminology. But one cannot argue thus from the general to the particular. Certainly we may, if we choose, define property in general in Rex-Frey terms. There are some obvious advantages to doing so. But in any given empirical instance, quote, the economic structure of society, end quote, may still turn out to be neither conceivable nor observable, quote, apart from the legal moral and political relationships of men. The burden of this chapter is to show that Marx never for a moment thought otherwise, and his concepts of production relations and economic structure must be comprehended accordingly. Similar arguments, we might note, apply to another of Cohen's attempted restrictions on the category of production relations. Cohen's exclusion from Marx's economic structure of so-called work relations, relations of production which Cohen terms material, as distinct from social relations between producers. So-called work relations include the forms of cooperation in the labor process and division of labor, quote, in the workshop. Discussed also as productive forces in the last chapter, but a specifically social relation between producers. Cohen means one, but by a specifically social relation between producers, Cohen means a social relation which, quote, entails an ascription to persons, specified or unspecified, of rights or powers vis-a-vis other men, end quote. This is another way of delineating his ownership relations. Not all relations between people and production are of this kind, and only those relations between people and production which are of this kind, in Cohen's view, enter Marx's so-called economic structure. The foundation of this distinction between social and material relations of production is Cohen's perfectly correct observation that Marx himself systematically distinguishes between material and social properties of the phenomenon he analyzes. We saw this in its relevance to Marx's theory of fetishism in the last chapter. But Cohen commits a similar reification here as he does with property. For the point is that in Marx, the relevant distinction lies between material and social attributes, properties, qualities, characteristics, features of productive phenomenon, not between different kinds of phenomenon in production as such. These two are, in other words, class concepts. Use as raw materials or instruments in the labor process, for instance, is a material characteristic which defines the class, means of production, while embodying value and commanding surplus value are social characteristics which define the class capital. But the empirical form constant capital exists only as a phenomenon which conjoins with these sets of attributes. Accordingly, as argued above, for class or attribute concepts generally, no purely, quote, material description, or come to that, no purely social description, can be a complete empirical account of any real entity in this realm of analysis. We have not sufficiently described constant capital. When we enumerate constant capital's material characteristics qua means of production, this is to refer only to, quote, the simple matter of capital, without regard to the formal character, without which capital is not capital. Remember the lemon again. Conversely, means of production only ever exist in some social form or another, just as there is no fruit that is not an apple, a pear, and so on. Cohen is aware of this. It is basic to his own account of fetishism. What Cohen apparently fails to realize, however, is that this totally invalidates Cohen's attempted work relations/social relations contrast. If so-called material and so-called social in Marx refer to attributes of phenomenon, not phenomenon as such, we cannot use his distinction to differentiate two different kinds of production relation, material and social. Nor, therefore, can we on these grounds expunge, quote, work relations from the economic structure of society. These supposedly separate material relations are but social relations of production regarded abstractly from their material side. Marx's distinction lies between the material and social dimensions of one and the same set of activities. Activities, we might recall, which he explicitly conceives from the start as, quote, double, simultaneously material and social, not between substantial kinds of relations as such. Section 3. Having, I hope, cleared some ground, let us now turn more directly to Marx. I have already quoted the poverty of philosophy on the impossibility of defining property as, quote, an independent relation, a category apart, an abstract and eternal idea, end quote. Quote, moralizing criticism and critical morality, end quote. A text dating from the same year agrees. Quote, private property, for instance, is not a simple relation or even an abstract concept, but consists in the totality of the bourgeois relations of production. In both cases, Marx defines property in terms of production relations rather than the other way about. The production relations in question are always historically specific. The relations of a given mode of production and property, therefore, the production relations in question are always historically specific. The relations of a given mode of production and property, therefore, emphatically a historical category. Marx's approach here contrasts sharply with Cohen's or Balibar's, both of whom, as we have seen, seek to ground the concept of production relations on a trans-historical, albeit rechtsfrei, concept of property. Indeed, property, as Marx uses the term in these texts, far from being susceptible to independent definition, is in fact synonymous with the, quote, economic structure of society, as delineated in the 1859 preface. Quote, moralizing criticism says that property consists of the, quote, totality of relations of production, end quote, which is exactly the preface description of the economic structure. We might, for a change, take quite literally the preface's claim that property and production relations are but different expressions for the same thing. As usual, however, Marx offers no general definition of a substantive kind of what these production relations, whether construed as property or economic structure, actually are. But given the apparent synonymity of the reference of these terms, exploration of what he had to say in various historical contexts about particular forms of property might take us some way forward in the search for what he understood by an economic structure. We may begin with some critical remarks on Hegel in Capital 3. Hegel, according to Marx, seeks to explain private property in land from the trans-historical premise that, quote, man, as an individual, must endow his will with reality, as the soul of external nature, and must therefore take possession of this nature and make it his private property. End quote. Marx. For Marx, this will to possession is, quote, comical. Quote, free property ownership of land, a very recent product, is, according to Hegel, not a definite social relation, but a relation of man as an individual to, quote, nature. An absolute right of man to appropriate all things. Hegel makes the blunder at the outset of regarding as absolute a very definite legal view of landed property belonging to bourgeois society. End quote. Marx. Basic to Marx's argument here is the idea that property is a social relation, not, or at least not primarily, but only consequentially, a relation of individuals to things. Marx says the same thing in Grundrisse, drawing a linguistic parallel we have encountered previously in his discussion of production. Quote, language as the product of an individual is an impossibility, but the same holds for property. End quote. Possession, Hegel's starting point, is indeed, quote, the subject's simplest juridical relation, end quote. But, quote, there is no possession preceding the family or master-servant relations, end quote. Quote, the concrete substratum, like family or master-servant relations, of which possession is a relation, is always presupposed, end quote. The appearance of property as an unmediated relation of possession between individual owners and the things they own is an illusion arising out of the phenomenal form property takes within specifically capitalist relations. It is an historical product. In previous forms of society, neither individuals as owners nor their property had their modern exclusivity or simplicity. Property did not even appear as a simple relation of person and thing. Who owned what, or even what it meant to be an owner, were by no means clear-cut. The very terms at issue are anachronistic. This is well brought out in the historian Mark Bloch's discussion of the inapplicability of modern concepts of property to medieval Europe. There, Bloch points out, quote, the word ownership, as applied to landed property, would have been almost meaningless. The tenant, from father to son, as a rule, plows the land and gathers in the crop. The tenant's immediate lord, to whom he pays dues, and who in certain circumstances can resume possession of the land, the lord of the lord, and so on, right up the feudal scale. How many persons are there who can say, each with as much justification as the other, quote, this is my field? Even this is an understatement, for the ramifications extended horizontally as well as vertically. An account should be taken of the village community, which normally recovered the use of the whole of its agricultural land as soon as it was cleared of crops, of the tenant's family, without whose consent the property could not be alienated, and of the families of the successive lords. End quote. Mark Bloch. Marx himself argues that landed property receives, quote, its purely economic form, end quote, i.e. landed property's modern capitalist form, of a relationship of exclusive individual possession, wrongly theorized as, quote, an eternal idea, end quote, by Hegel, only by, quote, discarding all its former political and social embellishments and associations, end quote, to become divorced from, quote, relations of domination and servitude, end quote. Only then can property appear as a simple relation of possession between individuals and objects. As any reader of Capital One or anyone with any familiarity with modern history will know, the making of this, quote, purely economic form of property was a protracted, bitter, and often bloody struggle, one Marx first encountered incidentally as early as 1842 with the transformation in the Rhineland of erstwhile common rights together wood into a crime. We will see later that the independent natural individual who appears to Hegel as the self-evident possessing subject is equally a modern phenomenon. One might perhaps maintain that the complexity to which Bloch points can be analytically encompassed within some notions of degrees of control of persons over things. Cohen's argument moves in this direction when he seeks to define the serf as a part owner of both means of production and labor power. It is questionable whether such a merely quantitative index of control is sufficiently subtle to allow us to differentiate the qualitative variety of forms which anything we might want to call property has taken historically. But this is, I would suggest, in any case, to miss the main thrust of Marx's argument. For what Marx does is precisely to shift the focus of the concept of property away from relations between people and things, from ostensible simple possession, to the social relations between people which make such appearances possible in the first place. In the process, just as with the fetishized conceptions of productive forces considered in the last chapter, Marx criticizes everyday ideas of property, of the sort systematized by Hegel, as an ideological expression of specifically capitalist conditions, whose extension elsewhere is profoundly anachronistic. These points are reinforced when we turn to Marx's extensive discussions of property in his early writings. Thus, in the Paris manuscripts of 1844, Marx writes, for instance, that, quote, private property is the product, the result, the necessary consequence of alienated labor, of the eternal relation of the worker to nature and to himself. True, private property is a result of the movement. True, it is a result of the movement of private property that we have obtained the concept of alienated labor, of alienated life in political economy. But analysis of this concept shows that though private property appears to be the reason, the cause of alienated labor, it is rather its consequence. Later, this relationship becomes reciprocal, estranged labor. Later, this relationship becomes reciprocal. Estranged labor is the direct cause of private property. End quote, Marx. Manuscripts of 1844. Marx goes on to say that, quote, the character of private property is expressed by labor, capital, and the relations between these two, end quote. This strikingly anticipates later and more famous formulations like Capital's observation that, quote, capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons established by the instrumentality of things, end quote. The overall argument of the 1844 manuscripts on private property is succinctly captured in two sentences, quote, material, immediately perceptible private property is the material perceptible expression of estranged human life, end quote. Conversely, quote, only when labor is grasped as the essence of private property, can the economic process as such be analyzed in its real concreteness, end quote. In the German ideology, Marx concretizes this analysis somewhat, but without losing its essentials. Marx argues that, quote, different forms of society are just so many forms of the organization of labor, and hence of property, end quote. Specifically, quote, division of labor and private property are identical expressions. In the one, the same thing is affirmed with reference to activity, as is affirmed in the other with reference to the product of the activity, end quote. For, quote, the various stages of development in the division of labor are just so many different forms of ownership, i.e., the existing stage of the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to the material, instrument, and product of labor, end quote. Marx elaborates, quote, with the division of labor is given simultaneously the distribution, and indeed the unequal distribution, both quantitative and qualitative, of labor and labor's products. Hence property, the nucleus, the first form of which lies in the family, where wives and children are the slaves of the husband. This latent slavery in the family, though still very crude, is the first property. But even at this early stage, it corresponds perfectly to the definition of modern economists, who call it the power of disposing of the labor power of others, end quote. The equation of property with, quote, power of disposing of the labor power of others, end quote, is one Marx employs repeatedly in texts of this period. That power, in more developed modes of production like capitalism, is certainly materialized in and affected in part through ownership of physical means of production. But it is worth underlining the fact that this is not the case with the family, whose relations Marx nonetheless claims here to be property relations. Power over people's labor power derives in this instance from direct personal patriarchal relations between individuals themselves. Modern Marxist anthropologists, not to mention feminist writers, concur with this insight. Section 4. I want to consider exactly what relations between people would, for Marx, qualify as property or production relations. I shall show from his own text that he indeed did, where historically relevant, include within this category relations which are, for traditional historical materialism, eminently, quote, superstructural. The, quote, economic structure of society was therefore for Marx a very different and a very much broader totality of social relations than is normally recognized. The examples I shall consider are drawn from Grundrisse and Capital, both undeniable, mature works. They are therefore not open to the sort of objections Althusserians might raise to my use of the 1844 manuscripts and the German ideology immediately above. They are, however, perfectly consistent with these early texts. Since both my examples concern the economic structure in non-capitalist societies, my examples also have the additional merit of suggesting if only by way of contrast, the rootedness of conventional, narrow definitions of the economic sphere in specifically capitalist forms of appearance. The section of the Grundrisse entitled, quote, Forms which precede capitalist production, is a long and largely self-contained disquisition on various historical forms of communal property and production, their gradual disintegration, and the eventual freeing of the elements of capitalist production. Such communal forms were to remain an abiding interest for Marx, increasingly so in his later years. A large part of his copious and still largely unpublished notes and manuscripts of the 1870s and 1880s are given over to this theme of communal forms. As noted by Shannon. In Grundrisse, Marx distinguishes three main communal types: primitive, ancient, and Germanic. All have variants. I'm not concerned here with the historical or anthropological accuracy of Marx's characterization of these forms of society, which by modern standards undoubtedly leaves a lot to be desired. As noted by Godelier. Nor with how his views on the character and development of communal property might have altered in later writings. I invoke these analyses simply to illustrate how he used his concepts. Marx's, quote, first form of landed property, end quote, the primitive commune, is characteristic of initially pastoral nomadic societies. Here individuals relate to land as, quote, property of the community producing and reproducing itself in living labor, end quote. Individuals are proprietors of the land insofar and only insofar as they are members of the community. Indeed, Marx says, strictly speaking, individuals as such are here merely possessors of the soil, for land is the property of the community as a whole. Marx is clear that the, quote, initial naturally arisen spontaneous community, end quote, which is the, quote, family and the family extended as a clan, end quote, appears as first presupposition, end quote, for this form of property. Quote, the clan community, the natural community, appear not as a result of, but as a presupposition for the communal appropriation, temporary, and utilization of the land. When they finally do settle down, the extent to which this original community is modified will depend upon various external, climatic, geographic, physical, etc. conditions, as well as on their particular natural predisposition, their clan character. This naturally arisen clan community, or, if one will, pastoral society, is the first presupposition. The communality of blood, language, customs, for the appropriation of the objective conditions of their life, and of their life's reproducing and objectifying activity. Activity as herdsmen, hunters, tillers, etc. The real appropriation through the labor process happens under these presuppositions, which are not themselves the product of labor, but appear as labor's natural or divine presuppositions, end quote, Marx. Here then, particular social relations, specifically familial relations, extended to the so-called clan community, are presupposed to appropriation through the labor process. And integral to these relations are, quote, communality of blood, language, customs, end quote. Blood, language, and customs are, of course, quote, superstructural phenomenon par excellence for most adherents to base superstructure models, and things which belong neither in the, quote, economic structure nor the superstructure, and thus lie outside the scope of historical materialist theory altogether, for Cohen. The so-called Asiatic form of property is a variant of this primitive form, though, Marx says, it at first sight appears not to be because of the individual's apparent propertylessness. In the Asiatic form of property, the, quote, comprehensive unity, standing above all these little communities, appear as the higher proprietor, or as the sole proprietor. The real communities hence exist only as hereditary possessors. Because the unity is the real proprietor and the real presupposition of communal property, it follows that this unity can appear as a particular entity above the many real particular communities. End quote. Marx's language here is dense, but he appears to be saying that in the Asiatic form, the unity formed in the cooperation of several communities becomes a, quote, presupposition of communal property, end quote. In exactly the same way as within any single community, the existence of the commune itself is such a presupposition. He instances water control as an important form of intercommune cooperation. Clearly, where artificial irrigation is a condition of production, and it requires intercommunal cooperation, such cooperation also becomes a condition of production and hence of property. Karl Wittfogel was to develop this line of argument and apply it to the modern USSR, though in ways uncongenial to most Marxists. Modern, quote, bureaucratic collectivist theorists reason similarly, drawing on Marx's analysis of the Asiatic mode of production vis-a-vis the, quote, socialist state in modern planned economies. In such cases, this transcommunal unity may be personified in the form of a despot. Property, quote, appears mediated for the individual through a cession by the total unity, a unity realized in the form of the despot, the father of many communities, to the individual through the mediation of the particular commune, end quote. Such a personification of social relationships is analogous to fetishism in the capitalist mode of production, though Marx himself does not draw the explicit parallel here. Surplus then goes to the personification of this unity, oriental potentate, clan patriarch, state, or whatever. Marx sees varieties of this, quote, Asiatic form of society as being very widespread, embracing Mexico, Peru, and early Celts, as well as India. Marx also suggests that among Slavs, this may have been the origin of villeinage. What is of interest for the present argument, however, is that once again, relations internal to a given mode of production and property form embrace, evidently, quote, superstructural phenomenon. Quasi-political relations of a tributary sort, and insofar as a specific mystification of the unity is involved, ideology too. Marx writes, for instance, of, quote, common labor for the exaltation of the unity, partly of the real despot, partly of the imagined clan being, the god, end quote. Marx's second form of landed property, the ancient, quote, also assumes the community as its first presupposition, end quote. The ancient Greek or Roman community, however, differs from the primitive or Asiatic archetype in several respects. The Greek or Roman community's basis is urban rather than rural. Quote, the cultivated field here appears as a territorium belonging to the town, end quote. We also see here the beginnings of private property, quote, communal property, and state property. Agere publicus is here separate from private property. The property of the individual is here not, unlike in the first case, itself directly communal property, end quote. The great problem in ancient society is no longer the conquest of nature, but maintenance of the territorium against other communes. Quote, war is the great comprehensive task, the great communal labor which is required either to occupy the objective conditions of being there alive, or to protect and perpetuate the occupation. Hence the commune consisting of families, initially organized in a warlike way, as a system of war and army, and this is one of the conditions of its being there as proprietor, end quote. The ancient commune, then, unlike the primitive, consists of individual private peasant proprietors. But at the same time, the condition of their property remains their communal organization, particularly for war. In this connection, Marx offers some interesting parentheses on antiquity's view of agriculture as the sole, quote, proper occupation of a free man, the soldier's school, end quote, and the consequent exclusion of craftsmen from citizenship. Importantly, however, the emergence here of private property does not obviate the communal character of the ancient form as a whole. Rather, quote, membership in the commune remains the presupposition for the appropriation of land and soil, but as a member of the commune, the individual is a private proprietor, end quote. Quote, the commune is the presupposition of property in land and soil, end quote. Still, quote, belonging is mediated by the individual's being a member of the state, by the being of the state, end quote. The individual is, in other words, only a private proprietor, insofar as he remains a member of the commune. The German ideology similarly observes that in antiquity, quote, the citizens hold power over their laboring slaves only in their community, and on this account alone are bound to the form of communal ownership, end quote. Certainly, quote, the survival of the commune is the reproduction of all the commune's members as self-sustaining peasants, end quote. But equally, their, quote, surplus time belongs precisely to the commune, the work of war, etc., end quote. For, quote, The property in one's own labor is mediated by property in the conditions of labor. The hide of land, guaranteed in its turn by the existence of the commune, and that in turn by surplus labor in the form of military service, etc., by the commune members. It is not cooperation in wealth-producing labor, unlike in the primitive form, by means of which the commune members reproduces himself. It is not cooperation in wealth-producing labor, unlike in the primitive form, by means of which the commune member reproduces himself, but rather cooperation in labor for the communal interests, imaginary and real, for the upholder of the association outwardly and inwardly. Property is quiritorium, i.e., the property of the Romans, or quirites, of the Roman variety. The private property of land as such, only as a Roman, but as a Roman he is a private proprietor of land. End quote. Property here is therefore integrally bound up with citizenship. It is only as a civis that an individual can be a proprietor. In this instance, then, it is membership specifically of a polis, and a participation in its military and other obligations, which Marx sees as a presupposed to property, and the material labor processes in which property is realized. That polis is understood, moreover, as a variant of the clan system, which also underpinned Marx's first communal form, the primitive. The ancient polis remains, in essence, an association of families grounded in the needs of war, even if the later Roman gens, or gens, are not strict blood kin. Marx approvingly quotes Niebuhr to the effect that, quote, there was in the world of antiquity no more general institution than that of kin groups, end quote. Finally, to Marx's third form of communal property, the Germanic form of communal property. Marx sees the Germanic form of communal property as typical of the medieval period in Europe. The Germanic communal property is in many ways a transitional form, representing a further development towards modern private property. Settlement here is sparse and society predominantly rural rather than urban. The commune now exists only as a periodic gathering together of the commune's members, quote, to pledge each other's allegiance in war, religion, adjudication, etc., end quote. The commune thus appears, quote, as a coming together, not as a being together, as a unification of independent subjects, landed proprietors, It thus, quote, appears as a coming together, not as a being together, as a unification of independent subjects, landed proprietors, and not as a unity. The commune does not, therefore, in fact exist as a state or political body as in classical antiquity, end quote. Marx still, however, considers that the unity in itself of commune members is nonetheless, quote, posited in their ancestry, language, common past and history, etc., end quote. And Marx continues to insist that the commune, quote, is presupposed in itself, prior to the individual proprietors, as a community of language, blood, etc., even if it only becomes a, quote, real assembly for communal purposes, end quote. there remains undivided communal land for grazing, hunting, and so on. But this does not take the separate form of state property, the agri publicus, as in antiquity. Rather, it is, quote, really the common property of the individual proprietors, not of the union of these individual proprietors endowed with an existence separate from themselves, end quote. Quote, individual property does not appear mediated by the commune. Rather, the existence of the commune and of communal property appears as mediated by, i.e., as a relation of, the independent subjects to one another, end quote. This characterizes the Germanic form more generally. Quote, the commune exists only in the interrelations between these individual landed proprietors and as such, end quote. Following these sketches, Marx draws some general conclusions. Quote, in all these forms, he writes, the, quote, relation to land and soil, to the earth as the property of the laboring individual, is instantly mediated by the naturally arisen, spontaneous, more or less historically developed, and modified presence of the individual as member of a commune, his naturally arisen presence as member of a tribe, etc. End quote. Hence, quote, if the objective conditions of his labor are presupposed as belonging to him, then he himself is subjectively presupposed as member of a commune through which his relation to land and soil is mediated, end quote. Marx goes on explicitly to discuss, quote, Marx goes on to explicitly discuss what, quote, property means in this context. He argues that, quote, property originally means no more than a human being's relation to his natural conditions of production as belonging to him as his, end quote. He then elaborates on the character of these, quote, natural conditions, making it clear once again that, quote, natural and, quote, social were not for him by any means exclusive categories. The forms of these natural conditions of production are double. 1. His existence as member of a community, hence the existence of his community, which in its original form is a clan system, a more or less modified clan system. 2. The relation to land and soil mediated by the community. End quote. The whole thing was a quote. So that last couple sentences were a quote. I think I forgot to say it. It looked like, doesn't matter. Fuck it. Hence, quote, a natural condition for production for the living individual is his belonging to a naturally arisen, spontaneous society, clan, etc. This is, e.g., already a condition of it for his language, etc. His own productive existence is possible only on this condition, end quote. This, of course, powerfully echoes Marx's characterization of production as always a, quote, double relationship in the supposedly immature German ideology. Marx concludes, and it is the only logical conclusion, that in these forms of society, quote, property therefore means belonging to a clan, end quote. Now, I argued earlier that for Marx, property and production relations were substantially synonymous concepts. He says much the same here, for instance, in this passage 3 pages later, quote, "The original unity between a particular form of community, clan, and the corresponding property in nature, which appears in one respect as the particular form of property, has its living reality in the specific mode of production itself, a mode which appears both as a relation between the individuals and as their specific active relation to inorganic nature, a specific mode of working, which is always family labor, often communal labor. This relation as proprietor, not as a result, but as a presupposition of labor, i.e. of production, presupposes the individual defined as a member of a clan or community." End quote. Marx. If property means, quote, "belonging to a clan," we must conclude that production relations in all these forms of society include all those relations by virtue of which individuals are clan or commune members. Not only do these include kinship relations, they embrace, quote, "communality of blood, language, customs," etc. They embrace, quote, "communality of blood, language, customs," end quote, and, in the Germanic case, a common historical experience or tradition. They extend to the entire polis of antiquity, members of which made the civis into a Romanus. They encompass, in the Asiatic case, ideology. There is simply no way for any of these pre-capitalist socioeconomic formations that we can even begin to exclude so-called superstructural terms from the very definition of so-called economic structures. To do so would make nonsense of Marx's entire analysis. It would also render the societies at issue incomprehensible. It will do no harm in passing here to move beyond Marx, to look for a minute at modern historical materialist anthropology. Meillassoux argues that, quote, "agricultural self-sustaining communities rely less on the control of the means of material production than on the means of human reproduction, subsistence, and women. Their end," the agricultural self-sustaining communities, "is reproduction of life as a precondition to production." Meillassoux uses this to explain my social power in the cases he examines tends to be distributed on the basis of age and gender, rather than property as traditionally conceived. Godelier goes still further, arguing of such societies that here, quote, "relations of kinship serve as relations of production, and this from within," end quote. Elsewhere, Godelier develops a similar case for the polis of ancient Athens. On this basis, Godelier rejects any general distinction between basis and superstructure as, quote, "so-called levels of social reality," as distinctions within social reality, which are in some sense substantive, institutional divides into its substance, end quote. Godelier. He maintains, as I do, that it is specifically capitalism which, quote, for the first time separated economics, politics, religion, kinship, art, etc., as so many distinct institutions, end quote. This is, of course, why restrictive conceptions of production relations and the hard and fast base superstructure distinctions they sustain do have some phenomenal purchase in bourgeois society, and cease to as soon as we move beyond its historical boundaries. Such work is immensely valuable, precisely because it is not founded in merely theoretical argument and recognizes criteria of adequacy other than coherence alone. If Marxist anthropologists have been forced, as was Marx himself a century earlier, to take a broad view of what comprises, quote, an economic structure, it is because the facts have resisted characterization otherwise. Section 5. To return to the Grundrisse, a little later, Marx significantly extends the argument I have traced thus far, telling us that, quote, slavery and serfdom are only further developments of the form of property resting on the clan system, end quote. The analysis of property developed here, then, would seem to apply to all the non-capitalist, quote, epochs in the economic formation of society, end quote. Asiatic, ancient, feudal, delineated in the 1859 preface, a very wide historical compass indeed. With that in mind, we may turn to the second substantive analysis of the property-production relations in Marx I wish to discuss, that of feudalism. His fullest treatment of the topic is in Capital Volume 3, where he raises it in the context of an inquiry into the origins of capitalist ground rent. As with the section of the Grundrisse we have just been examining, Marx's underlying concern in this text is with what distinguishes capitalist forms of landed property, so he focuses on feudal forms mainly for their contrast with capitalism rather than for their own sake. The major contrast he draws is like this: unlike in capitalism, where laborers are separated from the means of production, in feudal society, quote, the direct producer is to be found in possession of his own means of production, the necessary material labor conditions required for the realization of his labor and the production of his means of subsistence, end quote. This difference has an important implication for the mechanism of exploitation. The transfer of surplus labor or surplus labor's products to the ruling class in the two societies. We should remember, in discussing this, that this mechanism is absolutely crucial to Marx in characterizing a mode of production. Quote, the specific economic form in which unpaid surplus labor is pumped out of direct producers determines the relationship of rulers and ruled, as it grows directly out of production itself, and in turn reacts upon production as a determining element. Upon this, however, is founded the entire formation of the economic community, which grows up out of the production relations themselves, thereby simultaneously its specific political form. It is always the direct relations of the owners of the conditions of production to the direct producers, which reveals the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure, end quote. Marx. In capitalism, so-called economic pressure, alone suffices to ensure that the worker produces surplus for the capitalist. Given the laborer's lack of means of production, the only conditions under which he can produce his subsistence at all, selling his labor power for a wage, are ones which entail the performance of unpaid surplus labor. But in feudalism, things are different. From a purely economic viewpoint, the peasant can produce his subsistence on the land and with the animals, tools, and so on which he possesses, without having in the very process to produce surplus for his lord. Since feudal lords nonetheless manifestly do extract surplus labor, and feudal society would not be what feudal society is if the feudal lords did not extract surplus labor, Marx is led to draw the following conclusion. Quote, under such conditions, the surplus labor for the nominal owner of the land can only be extorted from them by other than economic pressure, whatever the form may be. Thus, conditions of personal dependence are requisite, a lack of personal freedom, no matter to what extent, and being tied to the soil as its accessory, bondage in the true sense of the word. End quote. Marx. It is a conclusion which Marx generalizes, quote, in all forms in which the direct producer remains the possessor of the means of production, end quote. Marx argues, quote, the property relationship must simultaneously appear as a direct relationship of lordship and servitude, end quote. Herrschaft, we must conclude, is here, quote, the specific economic form in which surplus is pumped, and hence constitutes, quote, the innermost secret, the hidden basis of the entire social structure, end quote. Other texts make this explicit. For Capital 1, quote, personal dependence here characterizes the social relations of production just as much as it does the other spheres of life organized on the basis of that production. Personal dependence forms the groundwork of society, end quote. We could hardly ask for a clearer statement of the internality of Herrschaftsverhältnisse to society's, quote, economic structure. For the Grundrisse likewise, quote, the master-servant relation is an essential element of appropriation, end quote. For theories of surplus value, the latter's, quote, basis is the forcible domination of one section of society over another. In feudal society, relations of personal dependence, relations, moreover, not founded upon, quote, effective control of the means of production, which Marx assumes the direct producer to enjoy, are essential relations of production, and hence consistently with the stipulations of the 1859 preface from the, quote, groundwork of society, end quote. To reduce Herrschaft, as Cohen does, simply to part ownership of labor power is in my view a travesty of what Marx is getting at in these analyses. The essence of the relationship he makes clear is, quote, appropriation of an alien will, end quote. Personal subjection, unfreedom. It also begs the empirical question of how, in other words, through what set of relations, such alien control over labor power is actually established. At one point in the Grundrisse, Marx goes so far as to assert that feudal landed proprietorship developed, quote, out of purely military relations of subordination, end quote. Given the amount of land administered by the medieval church, one might also want to give due weight to the power of the word. It is ironic, considering the labors of Cohen and others to produce a rechtsfrei definition of property, that in Europe feudal society By the High Middle Ages, Herrschaft was in fact largely organized through jurisdiction. In Perry Anderson's words, quote, justice was the ordinary name of power, end quote. This led Rodney Hilton recently to count jurisdiction explicitly as a key social relation of feudal production, unsurprisingly perhaps, since his own earlier writings estimate that by the 12th century, more than half of all feudal ruling class income took the form of profits of jurisdiction or taxes, rather than ground rent as such. Anderson himself argues similarly, and like Marx generalizes the point beyond feudalism alone. Quote, all modes of production in class societies prior to capitalism extract surplus labor from the immediate producers by means of extra economic coercion. Capitalism is the first mode of production in history in which the means whereby the surplus is pumped out of the direct producers is, quote, purely economic in form. All other previous modes of exploitation operate through extra economic sanctions. Kin, customary, religious, legal, or political. It is therefore impossible to read them off from economic relations as such. The so-called superstructures of kinship, religion, law, or the state necessarily enter into the constitutive structure of the mode of production in pre-capitalist social formations. These superstructures intervene directly in the, quote, internal nexus of surplus extraction, where in capitalist social forms, the first in history to separate the economy as a formally self-contained order, they provide by contrast its so-called external preconditions. In consequence, pre-capitalist modes of production cannot be defined except via their political, legal, and ideological superstructures, since these are what determine the type of extra economic coercion that specifies them, end quote. I would want to express the point more forcefully and say that what Anderson is getting at renders the very terms in which he, like Marx himself, formulates his argument, quote, economic versus, quote, non-economic, anachronistic. So-called superstructures cannot reasonably be said to, quote, intervene in a structure of which these superstructures are, quote, constitutive. A far better way of putting it would be to say that in these societies, a distinction between, quote, economic relations as such and, quote, superstructures, at least as conventionally drawn, simply does not obtain. Indeed, if we persist in using these concepts in the usual way, Anderson's observation comes very close to denying the applicability of Marx's claims for the primacy of the, quote, mode of production of material life outside capitalism. Superstructures, Anderson appears to be saying, determine the core relations of these modes, their specific modes of exploitation upon which, for Marx, quote, is founded the entire formation of the economic community, end quote. Anderson's frequent recourse to quotation marks is perhaps indicative of some unease. I doubt he intends thus to curtail the scope of historical materialism. Nonetheless, he goes on to make a very important point. Since, Anderson says, feudal societies are defined by their, quote, non-economic mechanisms of surplus extraction, To specify feudal societies in Reichsfrei terms, abstracting from so-called superstructures, leaves us with no basis for differentiating between them. This had a paradoxical historiographic consequence. Quote, if, in effect, the feudal mode of production can be defined independently of the variant juridical and political superstructures which accompany it, such that its presence can be registered throughout the globe, wherever primitive and tribal social formations were superseded, the problem arises, how is the unique dynamism of the European theater of international feudalism to be explained? End quote. A, quote, colorblind materialism, end quote, eventuates in historical idealism, for the differentiating factors can then, logically, only be sought outside the sphere of so-called material life. Cohen does discuss Marx's analysis of feudalism. He could hardly fail to, given their evident awkwardness for, quote, traditional historical materialism. What Cohen says is, to my mind, implicitly subversive of his overall conception of production relations. Cohen cannot but recognize that for Marx, quote, the production relations of slavery or serfdom include the authority of the superior over the producer's labor power, and he exploits it by exercising that authority. End quote. Cohen, 1978. Violence and ideology are thus admitted to be internal to feudal exploitation, or constitutive of the specifically feudal property form. On the face of it, this must collapse the base superstructure distinction as Cohen conceives it, to yield a broader conception of economic structure. Cohen tries to evade the difficulty, insofar as Cohen recognizes the difficulty at all, by arguing that the serf is not in fact the owner but merely the possessor of his plot, so that, quote, the rights he enjoys over it are tied to the performance of his duties, end quote. To the extent that we can speak of so-called ownership without anachronism in this context, this is undoubtedly true, but it hardly helps Cohen. Cohen remains hoist by his own petard. For Marx's point, well taken by Anderson, is that, quote, economically, the serf precisely is in a position to produce his own subsistence. And any Rechtsfrei definition of ownership would have to acknowledge this fact. The only thing which curtails his, quote, effective control of either means of production or his labor power is the eminently Rechtsvoll relationship of Herrschaft. It would be nice to know what Herrschaft means. It is only through the latter, Marx's quote, non-economic coercion, that we can in fact meaningfully characterize the lord's, quote, ownership, as distinct from the peasant's material possession at all. As with Marx's three forms of communal property, the, quote, political and legal superstructure, end quote, turns out once more to be internal to the, quote, economic structure of society, end quote, a defining element of, quote, property in the feudal context. Section 6. In the earlier sections of this chapter, I sought to establish on both empirical and theoretical grounds that we had no good reason for excluding any kind of social relation from being a possible relation of production, or for arbitrarily assigning some social relations to the base and others to the superstructure of society a priori. These questions could only be resolved for particular historical forms of society on empirical criteria. I have now shown that in analyzing concrete historical formations, Marx himself was no respecter of neat base superstructure models. Indeed, I have suggested that the apparent separability of the so-called economic sphere from Acton's so-called legal, political, and moral relationships of men is a phenomenon of capitalism alone. And orthodox conceptions of production relations are therefore methodologically akin. In their immediate generalization of capitalist appearances to the fetishized view of productive forces discussed in Chapter 2, a theme I shall take further below. The clear implication of this argument is that for Marx, production relations are, very simply, any and all social relations which are demonstrably entailed in a given mode of production or way, or quote, way in which people produce their means of subsistence. Excuse me, I'm going to reread that. The clear implication of this argument is that for Marx, production relations are, very simply, any and all social relations which are demonstrably entailed in a given mode of production, or, quote, way in which people produce their means of subsistence, end quote. To put it the other way around, the production relations of a given mode are all those relations between people, in whose absence they would not be producing in that particular way. Such production relations and the, quote, economic structure production relations define may include Cohen's, quote, material relations, quote, superstructural relations, or relations Cohen deems beyond the purview of historical materialism entirely, like familial forms. Examples of all these being treated as internal to a, quote, economic structure can be found in Marx's work. What is or is not a production relation in any given instance can only be determined a posteriori, on the facts of the case. We have no good theoretical grounds for defining the categories more restrictively, and Marx's own practice suggests he did not intend that we should. Since property is for him merely another appellation of production relations, the same holds for what comprises, quote, ownership. George McLennan criticized an earlier and less elaborated formulation of this argument, has expressed the worry that so open a definitional criterion of production relations might be satisfied by random empirical evidence. McLennan's concern is that everything will collapse into a vague concept of, quote, social relations, and historical materialism lose its distinctiveness. I do not see the danger. If it is claimed that social relation X is essential to and therefore a production relation of mode of production Y, the case needs to be empirically argued and counterclaims can be empirically evaluated. Certainly there may be disputes, but I fail to see why their resolution should be considered, quote, arbitrary. Arbitrariness is only a risk, so long as such claims are not subjected to any process of empirical adjudication. What I think worries McLennan and other critics is my refusal of a determinate concept of production relations at the level of general theory, which is where Marxists habitually seek it. My point, however, is that in Marx's analytic framework, conceptual determinateness can only be provided a posteriori for specific historical formations. That is not to say, however, that it cannot be provided at all. Two final quotations might appropriately be cited by way of conclusion to this long argument. When, in the German ideology, Marx describes production as a, quote, double relationship, both material and social, he adds, quote, by social we understand the cooperation of several individuals, no matter under what conditions, in what manner, and to what end, end quote. German ideology. We might take this openness for once at face value. Similarly with this remark against Proudhon in the Grundrisse, quote, human life has from time immemorial rested on production, and in one way or another on social production, whose relations we call precisely economic relations, end quote. What Marx is doing here is so devastatingly simple, and at the same time so genuinely revolutionary, that generations of commentators have somehow managed to overlook it. He is not, as with traditional historical materialism, reducing social relations to economic relations, as conventionally conceived, or explaining the former in terms of the latter. He is precisely redefining economic relations, and thus the economic sphere, or the economic structure, or the so-called economic base of society, as comprising the totality of social relations, whatever the totality of social relations may be, which make particular forms of production and thus of property possible. These social relations are simultaneously forms of material relation of human beings to nature. This totality is Marx's, quote, groundwork of society, and its extensiveness indicates why Marx could plausibly treat material production as being synonymous with production of, quote, the society itself, i.e. the human being itself, in its social relations, end quote, or assert that, quote, the relations of production in their totality constitute what are called the social relations, society, end quote. Such propositions are grossly reductionist on any other interpretation. As he wrote in 1846, introducing the notion of a mode of production, this mode, quote, must not be considered simply as being the reproduction of the physical existence of individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. What we have here is end quote, German ideology. What we have here is less an economic and still less a technological theory of history or society, in any standard sense of the word, quote, economic, than an agenda for a historical sociology of economic forms and phenomena. Section 7. The final issue I wish briefly to air in this chapter, and I do not pretend to do any more, concerns what I take to be a serious lacuna in Marx's work and the historical materialist tradition generally. This is the question of human reproduction and its connection with, quote, material production, as Marx conceived it. The context in which I raise this, and which has made it visible as a theoretical problem, is, of course, the renaissance of feminist scholarship in recent years, which questions the paradigms of all classical sociologies, including Marxism. I have argued that Marx's conception of the, quote, material groundwork of society was far broader than that normally ascribed to him. The question I want to raise here is, was that conception sufficiently broad, or could it be made sufficiently broad to accommodate, without subordinating, the undoubted sociological insights of feminist analysis? I shall suggest that it was not, but could be made so, and that Marx's own writings provide some grounds for undertaking the task with his posthumous blessing. Thus, to revise historical materialism, however, would leave few familiar Marxist theoretical landmarks intact. Conventionally, by production, Marxists understand production of material goods, and modes of production are defined and differentiated according to how this is effected. Marx speaks of a mode of production as a way in which people produce their means of subsistence. It is true and important that he recognized such production as simultaneously being the production of social relations. But the relations he had in mind were specifically those entailed in the production of goods, such as the kinship relation of the primitive commune, the ancient polis, the feudal Herrschaft, or the labor-capital class relations. It is production of goods, therefore, which demarcates the field, whose social form constitutes the specific object of historical materialist inquiry. But in certain of Marx's writings, notably the German ideology, the notion of, quote, production and reproduction of real life, end quote, has a significantly wider compass than this. Near the beginning of that text, Marx and Engels list a number of, quote, material factors in human life, routinely overlooked by idealist historiography, which Marx and Engels say are, quote, premises of their own viewpoint. The first and second of these are the need to produce goods to live, and the development of new human needs and capacities in the process. Marx and Engels continue, quote, the third circumstance, which, from the very outset, enters into historical development, is that men, who daily remake their own life, begin to make other men, to propagate their own kind. The relation between man and woman, parents and children, the family, end quote. These three aspects of social activity, they go on to make clear, quote, are not of course to be taken as three different stages, but just as three aspects, or to make it clear to the Germans, three moments, which have existed simultaneously since the dawn of history and the first men, and which still assert themselves in history today, end quote. Marx and Engels. The next sentence The one I have severally quoted on production as a, quote, double relationship includes within the, quote, production of life both production of, quote, one's own life in labor, end quote, and production, quote, of fresh life in procreation, end quote. Production of goods and production of people are thus given equal status here, conjointly defining, quote, the production of life, and equally integral to people's, quote, materialistic connection, end quote. Marx's declared analytic starting point, a page or two later in a passage I have already quoted more fully, Marx refers to, quote, the nucleus, the first form, end quote, of both property and division of labor as being, quote, the family, where wife and children are slaves of the husband, end quote. While later in the same manuscript he writes of, quote, marriage, property, the family, end quote, as, quote, the practical basis on which the bourgeoisie has erected its domination, end quote. It must be said, however, that Marx did not take these fragmentary observations much further in his subsequent work. Engels did, in his Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State of 1891, but in ways that are problematic. Marx recognized the importance of familial and clan relations to pre-capitalist property forms. As we have seen, in the Grundrisse and elsewhere, but only insofar as these are relations of production of material goods. The probable reason for this failure to return to family forms in later writings, also stated in the German ideology, is that Marx considered the family to be, quote, a subordinate relationship, end quote, in more developed forms of society. Thus, the Communist Manifesto roundly declares that capitalism has, quote, put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous, quote, cash payment, end quote. Marx and Engels, 1848, Communist Manifesto. This sweeping and undoubtedly inaccurate judgment reads somewhat ironically in the light of recent work on the multiple ways in which capitalist production continues to be organized through patriarchal forms of relationship, both within and outside the, quote, workplace, narrowly considered, and the labor market. It explains, however, why Marx should have given his third material circumstance so little explanatory weight in later writings, by comparison with the modes of production of goods. Nonetheless, it is clear that in principle Marx did consider production of human beings, and thus, presumably, the relations through which production is organized, to be as essential to, quote, production of life as is the production of goods. It would have been surprising and inconsistent had he not, since he recognized human labor as common to all labor processes, and repeatedly stressed, moreover, that individuals were always social, and therefore specifically and differentially socialized human beings. His exclusion of, quote, the relation between man and woman, parents and children, the family, end quote, therefore, from the ways in which modes and thus forces and relations of production are conceptualized can be defended if, and only if, his claim that this is a, quote, subordinate relationship stands. He must show that such relations are wholly a corollary or a consequence of ways in which people produce their means of subsistence. Now, this is a substantive judgment open to empirical inquiry. If it turns out to be wrong, then, on Marx's own self-declared premises, the notion of, quote, production of life, and the concepts employed to analyze it, must perforce be extended to encompass modes, forces, and relations of human reproduction as well as of, quote, material production, more narrowly considered. The historical record, I suggest, powerfully argues for just such a revision. The relations generally of a patriarchal sort, within which social individuals are produced, cannot wholly be reduced to aspects or epiphenomenon of modes of production, as historical materialism has traditionally conceived them. Indeed, if anything, patriarchal relations have independently informed and influenced the ways the production of goods has been socially organized, to a massive and still largely unrecognized extent. Relations between capital and labor, for instance, were frequently structured through patriarchal master-servant norms well into the 19th century. And understanding this might take the transition to capitalism that much easier to grasp, not as a total rupture, but as a subtler degradation of forms. Outside capitalism's metropolitan heartlands, they often still are. Developed capitalism rests on a separation of household and enterprise, Max Weber tells us. How can we begin to comprehend that separation empirically, without reference to division of labor of an eminently patriarchal kind? English law and polity in the 1800s, that heyday of supposedly individualist Victorian capitalism, were permeated through and through with the social power of the, quote, household head, the paterfamilias, who alone, as Diana Barker reminds us, could actually be a, quote, freely contracting individual, end quote. The patriarchal households had been an organizing matrix of productive activities, political authority, taxation and administration, law and franchise, and religious worship, as well as, quote, domestic ideology in England, since time out of mind. Indeed, its unspoken assumption underpins even Marx's own determination of the value of labor power in Capital, Volume 1. Here, a man of his own patriarchal times, Marx did not seek to unravel, quote, natural, self-understood forms of social life, end quote. He took their naturalness very much for granted, such as the enduring power of patriarchy. In fact, these forms of patriarchy would emerge as essential relations of the relevant stages of capitalist production, on the criterion advocated above, since they are clearly social relations in whose absence production of goods would not have taken the empirical forms it did. This is undoubtedly an advance on so-called traditional historical materialism. But that is not the point, or at least not the whole point. To acknowledge the patriarchal dimension of a given set of production relations conceived as those relations necessary to a mode of production of material goods, is not to explain patriarchy itself. I reject the view advocated by some Marxist feminists that patriarchal relations can be explained with reference to their economic functionality, on both theoretical and empirical grounds. The burden of modern feminist argument is rather to suggest an independent, if material, basis for age and gender relations, which is the particular concern of feminist theory. Now, the specific terrain of that theory is precisely, quote, the relation of man and woman, parents and children, the family, end quote. Or in other words, the mode of production, conception, birth, nurturing, socialization of human beings. Exactly the dimension missing. The dimension missing. Because considered a, quote, subordinate relationship from Marx's analysis of, quote, production of life after 1846. Explicitly to revise Marx's concept of production to include, as he first intended, production of human individuals within familial and other relations, and what might follow from that for human society as a whole, might allow the possibility of reconciling Marxist and feminist perspectives without subordinating the specific concern of the latter. Specific concerns of the latter. Retention of Marx's own conception of, quote, mode of production as the starting point for sociological analysis, notwithstanding its capacity to recognize the economic import of relations of human reproduction, does not. Had Marx developed his broader German ideology view of, quote, the production of life, the conceptual apparatus of historical materialism might have looked very different. Mode, forces, and relations of production would be very much wider notions, even than those I have advocated here. If indeed those concepts, or only those concepts, remain the fundamental categories of historical materialism at all. Class relations would remain a central dimension, but would not necessarily be seen as the central, let alone the exclusive dimension of social structure. Age and gender relations would be an integral part, age and gender relations would be as integral an analytic concern. One way forward, again mooted in the German ideology, might be to approach all these social relationships as forms of division of social labor. Labor, however, extending well beyond just those activities which produce material goods. And to think the unthinkable, we might not even be differentiating social formations or periodizing history in the traditional Marxist way at all. What feudalism and capitalism have in common, for instance, a certain patriarchal infrastructure, might become as significant as what distinguishes them. Forms of the sexual division of labor, both within and without production narrowly considered, being a common presupposition of either set of class relations. These are my views, not Marx's. To attempt to develop historical materialism along these lines, however, seems to me not inconsistent with the intellectual and emancipatory spirit of Marx's own enterprise. Marx was, after all, engaged in a quote, critique of economic categories, end quote, and there is no good reason to see that critique as terminating in the 19th century, or bound forever in its, quote, natural, self-understood forms of social life, end quote.